Okay. Hi, I'm Chris FLAKUS. I'm co-editor-in-chief of Defunct Magazine. Thank you all for viewing Mentors Nights on your laptops or phones or however you're streaming this during the COVID-19 quarantine. Um, this is great of everyone who participated. It means so much to us. Thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, let's get started.
When we first were planning this event and going to hold it, we were going to hold it at the very lovely Trans Art Gallery off of, what is it, Alabama? West Alabama?
West Alabama, yeah.
Which Roberto very graciously put us in connection with Serbic Angelini, who owns that gallery, who is just an amazing, amazing person. And we would love to have you all back to have an event there again, because it truly is a beautiful reading space and a beautiful gallery. And she's a very cool lady. But when we were a little distraught over it, one of our mentors who's here with us tonight, Roberto Tejada, was just like, well, let's just still do it. Let's do it online. And he, in that conversation, in that email conversation, he suggested the topic for this roundtable discussion, which is, when normal life in Houston ceased and our venues became unable to safely provide us a space, Roberto Tejada charged us to move this event into the virtual arena. During the course of the conversation, he suggested that we take a moment to discuss the sweeping impact of the present moment, its challenges to the imagination, and the new forms of life we're being called to enact. Okay, now, so as defunctees, I asked the team to come up with a couple of questions for you, so we do have some guiding questions, but if anyone wanted to field an opening comment in response to the topic itself, now's the time.
And the big question that's been on my mind, and I mean, this goes for all art. I'm specifically thinking about writing because I'm a writer, but it applies across all fields and disciplines. A challenge that I've found in trying to write new material has been that I have this unanswered question of what kind of world am I writing for? What's the world going to look like in a week, let alone a month or a year? I feel like the magnitude of what's happening is going to shift things in really indelible ways. How do we write for a world or produce art for a world that is such an unknown?
On the one hand, it will be, it seems to me, absolutely and radically different, and in many ways it will be very much the same. And I guess I'll just begin with the very much the same, where it's I mean, I think the imagination is always governed by the conditional what if, right? And we're always writing either what if or as if, and it seems to me that we're writing into a world as if it resembles something like the patterns and practices that we've been habituated to and accustomed to, but clearly we're doing it from, on the one hand, a solitude that perhaps we're better equipped to deal with as writers because so much of what we do is in solitude. But on the other hand, what we distribute in terms of like the descriptions of the world and the energies of the kind of writing that we're interested in are now, we have to find other ways of appearing to other people, right? I mean, this is why I think that even just the will to to bring how many of us together, 13, and have it video recorded in some kind of way, and have this be the beginning of a conversation, always the sort of the penultimate version of a conversation, is one way of living, I think, a future, not the long future, but a very immediate future. I mean, I think we can only think about this in increments of time.
I kind of want to just sort of dovetail from that, because I had never thought of this before until Roberto mentioned this, but like this idea that like we, by virtue of being writers, or somehow, or we are actually kind of better equipped to deal with this than a lot of people. For me, I'm having to recalibrate, like, so I'm here in my house with my wife and stuff, right? And I understand that like a lot of people are not sort of living, or they're living by themselves, or I'm struggling to sort of like, I'll just get personal because it's just you guys. So she had just lost her uncle last night to suicide. it had never occurred to me that some people cannot handle solitude. And that's something that I'm having to recalibrate as I look forward, that like this thing that we almost take for granted is like by virtue of sort of being monastic within our art or with our work, and we somehow developed a way in which we could sort of intellectually or mentally keep ourselves stimulated in these times, sort of like extended periods of time, right? Writing a dissertation or a thesis or a novel or whatever it is. But some people literally don't know what to do with themselves. And I feel like, even I gotta be honest, I'm feeling shades of this as this gets deeper and deeper, as they say, okay, this is going to be not just April, but May. We're going to open up the economy. It's going to get worse. And then we're going to go into, they're thinking the vaccine is going to be by 2022. I think that's really optimistic, actually. I think you're starting to look at what's happening in New York, and you start talking with like people who are living through what's happening in New York on this level in which they're having to deal with, you know, death on a kind of an industrial level. I think we don't know what we don't know yet. And I think it's really hard to sort of like, that's the first death, my wife's uncle, that sort of really touched our family. And you could argue it was not COVID-19, but was sort of the fallout of this sort of isolation, right? If it's one thing that I feel like I have like this sort of broad scope answer than a more technocratic answer. I feel like the writer's obligation right now, and we've talked about this, Chris, a little bit, is sometimes it's okay to look up from the page and just observe. You know, Carolyn Forche would just say, bear witness, man. It's good to be at work, and I think there is a lot of motions to make us feel like, you know, business as usual, go through the sort of this neoliberal economic capitalist sort of the motions of it to make it seem like there's some semblance. But, you know, we know that, you know, what's his name? Farad, was it? Had mentioned that he said, you know, there's a sort of Michael Faras had mentioned we're kind of on our own here, right? And that sort of business as usual is a sort of like ways in which they can sort of bait and switch, and they you know, almost like when Houston flooded, they say Houston strong, and this is like idea. The whole thing, it seemed like a good idea, but like the idea behind Houston strong was like, you are strong for having survived this, but it's completely deflected from like, why did the city flood in the first place, right? And so you're starting to see this like getting busy and this sort of this inclination to keep busy as sort of this this continuation of this neoliberal economic capitalist model. But I think that is not sustainable. And the other side of that is, you know, what does the world need after we see mass like death on an industrial scale? What is the world going to need after we the death starts sort of circling in around people we know?
That leads to another question, Daniel. Like, what does it mean for us to be bearing witness and to be at the same time simultaneously a victim of what is a shared global trauma, and then also in consideration of our own country's lack of preparedness for this situation?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, like you guys mentioned, you know, we're going to be judged really harshly by the way we respond to this. But I think that's I do want to sort of, it's the one thing that sort of living in Mexico had really taught me was, you know, this is a moment in which we can recognize, just like Ayotzinapa and Tlatelolco had sort of really laid bare the machinery of the Mexican fabric, that the pueblo and the government are two separate people, right? The government isn't necessarily the pueblo, you know, the people, right? And I think there is some silver lining to this. I feel like moving forward, the idea that like we recognize now that, you know, it's just us, man. And it's terrifying. But to this end, we can bring the shit down if we wanted to. You see how much power labor has, and they want to reopen up the economy again because, you know, they realize that all these hedge fund managers and American Airlines and GM and Chrysler and Ford, they're going bankrupt, right? they're crumbling. A lot of that rests on the American worker. And I think right now we're in a really precarious moment. What do we do with that information? What do we do on May Day? You know, do you pay the rent or you do not pay the rent, right? If we wanted to, right? And that's what we know that the central bank is the backstop for all of these. They're the people that are holding this together. There's a great article came out in The Guardian. So we were hours away from a complete economic collapse in March 26th. The only thing that stopped it was European Central Bank and American Central Bank. But if everyone stopped, if the complete facade of it fell, we have so much leverage as, you know, quote unquote, the proletariat. You could really tear it down if you wanted to. And what do we do with that?
I definitely I really empathize strongly with everybody's points, but especially Daniel, the points you were making. I mean, they echoed a lot of how I'm feeling now. I mean, I think like I myself have been thinking much more in terms of whatever's going to come out after this. It cannot be back to the way it was before, because the whole reason we're in this situation in the first place is because of just how things were before in the first place. And they were, even before the COVID-19 hit, things were already so dysfunctional and so, turned against, working people who just want to have, carve out a modicum of dignity in this country. Like that window is shrinking, ever more, by the day. And now it's like, how to imagine a future that is, I think as people are kind of inside, to me, there's a cruel irony to all of this, because when we are kind of inside now, dealing with this global pandemic that faces all of humanity, and we have this extra time to think, we think about what's important, and most of us kind of realize that the most important thing is not, money and, capitalism and this global neoliberalist system that's, wreaked havoc on the world for decades. It's the relationships we have to one another and like how we're able to be together. And the cruel irony of it is that, in the moment when when I think, the silver lining, and this is perhaps the soil is most ripe for that, all of humanity at once to really come to that realization, we are unable to physically be together and organize. And so it's like how to, if this is not a moment when all of the American people should just stand up and say general strike in the streets, then what is, but then how do we organize that if we can't be around each other?
In some way, I think about this, I don't want to hog this, but I think about this a lot, that we have mass unemployment. They think it's going to hit 30%, worse than the Great Depression. I read a statistic the other day where it was like between like March 15th and like April 2nd or something like that. Like just a few weeks, we had the number of employment filed than the entire like Great Recession, pretty much. You think in like 2008 through like over years, right? And there's a lot of people who are going to be defaulting on loans, on their student loans, on rent. We know we can't eat. Food lines are longer than ever before. I do wonder if in solidarity, if there was a May Day strike or something where everyone just said, in solidarity, none of us are paying rent, you would see the conversation suddenly shift. And it's been handed to us, actually, because some people's hands have been forced in that direction. They say, well, we can't pay anyway. We can't afford to be consumers anymore. This is why West Texas crude is at an all-time low. We know that Texas oil and gas state, that it's the perfect storm. We have so much leverage, but there needs to be a single voice that says, look, this is a situation, that's how much leverage we have. They don't have a leg to stand on.
But the thing I find that like I've and I want to believe that that's true, but it's like I don't know. I mean, I put so much hope and faith myself personally into like the Bernie Sanders campaign, and I know that in our extremely basically non-existent democracy, if you look at electorally how messed up it is to vote and how much rampant voter suppression there is in this country, but I know there's doubts about electoralism. Those caveats aside, I mean, I felt like Bernie Sanders captured this attitude of like people are just fed up of living in this system that just like treats them like exploitable pieces of garbage to be discarded, and it's like him dropping out now and him losing, or the Democratic establishment conspiring against him. Not to get too political, but it's just like, if there is all this leverage, then why wasn't he winning? Why wasn't he just blowing it out of the water?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of money in politics, a lot of airtime that's given or not given. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I do think we're in sort of like a watershed moment. But no, I have a lot of empathy for that. I was a Bernie guy myself. I have quite a bit of empathy for that. But you know what? I do wonder too. Is like if you're starting to see people like this is wild, man. I was just watching I sometimes watch the evening news because I just like to see what is America watching right now. Like what are they seeing? I saw the one they'd done David Muir had done this thing in San Antonio, these food bank lines, and you're seeing Jaguars in line for food. You're seeing BMW 3 Series. Man, I've never even been in a BMW 3 Series. It's like I think there are enough people who are maybe second guessing the quote unquote middle class. How much of this is gilded? Yeah, I would say that.
Well, I was just going to add that I think this is a perfect opportunity for writers and artists to use the time to bring these issues to the forefront, right? And use whatever outlets that are available to us, right, to make that available. I think we see this in history. History does repeat itself, but I also think too that we should look at history as a reference to see as what worked and what didn't. And if you're so moved to speak to that end with your writing, then you should.
During Jonathan and Katherine's conversation, they kind of touched on the topic of the pressure of the time that we have, the pressure of being idle. And I wonder if that ties into the sense of solitary and solitude that some people are experiencing. Because Jonathan, you also mentioned that you had spoken to a number of friends who have been complaining of depression and isolation. I myself am an extroverted person, so isolation alone with my family has been like they're trapped with me, kind of. So I think it's probably kind of stressful for them, more so than myself. But so I wanted to touch a little bit more on that, on what is that pressure to make use of this idle time, and how is that impacting us?
Yeah. I honestly, I maybe come from a different perspective. I haven't had any idle time, is what I feel like, between like schooling and work, and sort of, touching base with my elderly parents in New York and a number of family members in Italy. And it feels like it's really claustrophobic in terms of, where my time's at. That being said, like sort of the moments I do turn to writing, on some occasion, it's like, well, maybe I need to sort of re-envision everything I've been working on to sort of, look at it through the prism of the world we've now entered. But on the other hand, I've sort of taken some solace in, revisiting work that sort of existed prior to this and sort of re-inhabiting a space that is independent in some way, shape, or form. Like, even if it's just for sort of an imagination, sort of imaginative purposes, independent of sort of what's informing the present moment. So I'm looking forward to some idle time, and I sort of fantasize about what that might be like. But I also feel like personally, like, I'm also sort of overwhelmed by the prospect of it. So maybe someone else can talk to like what it's been like to sort of have to fill their hours in some way, shape, or form, either creatively or otherwise. But on the one hand, I'm sort of dreaming of it, and on the other hand, I'm dreading it. Like, I'm talking to my parents who are both retired in their own way. Retired. They're going crazy, and sort of I sort of fear that on the other end of this busy period, that sort of culminates with the semester.
As a parent, and I know we have a number of parents that were on this call, sometimes I do look at my cohorts in the magazine and in my fellow classmates who don't have that element to their quarantine, and they're complaining a little bit about the all the free time, and I'm just like, I have a 4-year-old. There's no free time. But I think there is something unique to be said about being trapped with the people that we're supposed to love best, and the tensions that are on the rise in that situation. Both at moments I have felt much closer to my spouse, and then at other times I felt like I was on the border of wanting to massacre everyone in this household. So it's been a fine line, and I'm curious to see.
Pause.
It could be. Where's Anne? It's already kicking in. Well, middle 30s, it's a thing. So those of you that haven't had your time, who have been crazily trying to change your in-classroom situations, because I know a number of you are teachers who are used to hosting a class, and then being all of a sudden expected to now convert your entire life to an online platform. And I imagine for those of you that work in administration, I know Tamara and I work at a nonprofit, we've had to go online as well. Yeah, it's been a little maddening, right? Slightly.
Just a little bit.
I think
I want to strangle each and every one of my coworkers, but in a loving way.
It's funny, like this I think this is like this period, both in terms of the darker aspect of, you know, we're being reminded of our mortality, but also the more lighthearted aspect of like, just, you know, you thought technology was so wonderful before this, but now you're reminded of even like the most basic kind of human communication is rendered so clumsy and frustrating and exhausting by technology. It's just like, I don't know, a silver lining I hope comes out of this is this will maybe bring us back to, you know, a connection with our ancestors, you know, and what it really means to be human, and maybe a reconfiguration of, you know, what that means on such a wide scale, especially because, you know, I mean, definitely with the coronavirus, you know, humanity's fate is sealed in the same envelope, and maybe that will just lead to more internationalism and more, you know, like a sufficient critical mass of people will just have a change of perspective, and people will realize that humanity's fate is all sealed in the same envelope. But maybe that's too optimistic.
I have a quick question, and this again, I feel like fiction is usually the lens that I view the world, but this may be less so poetry and art. But so a week ago, I read Catherine Ann Porter's *Pale Horse, Pale Rider*. It's a very, very short novel set during the Spanish flu epidemic, and it struck me how little, I guess, plague literature there is. I mean, you think even like Albert Camus, the plague, that's kind of metaphorical. And I thought Catherine Ann Porter's book really struck out on its own, because it was really this kind of no holds barred treatment of the trauma of sickness on the body and just kind of the experience of it. Whereas most plague literature or poetry, say with the AIDS epidemic, it kind of looks at it through a social political sphere. There you go. So how do you write about something that is indifferent to social class, that affects rich and poor alike? I mean, obviously there's great disparity there, and there's communities that are far more vulnerable. But how do we tackle this issue when a disease, I mean, a virus like this, it cares only for ourselves?
As much as, and this is something that I don't want to sound like insensitive, but like, and Carmen Marie Machado actually taught me this, where she said, you know, with the dark, you gotta have the light. With having its complex characters or situations are really, you know, you look outside your window, something funny is happening like right now. Something really, you know, even if you look at like Dickens, right? It was like this whole thing, Streaky Bacon, which is like, you know, you got to mix the funny with the sad. That humanity, right? That touch of humanity, I think, is always going to be the thing that it's you know, like T.R.A. Jones would always say, write something about people and their problems, not problems and their people. And I think right now, the way it's being covered in this macro level, it's hard not to think about it in that macro level. Like, fuck, I gotta go outside, you know. But like that, even that feeling of going to the grocery store, that, or having that reading that we had in San Antonio, and it was totally innocuous, and there were kids, and you know, those weird lamentations sometimes in those interstitial moments, like, oh fuck, man, I can't believe we did that. Like that was fun. It was, you know, but I think there's a general level of, and you see, you know, especially in Kafka or something, this sort of low boil absurdity to a lot of life. And I think right now we're hitting this sort of peak absurdity. It sounds insensitive, but like, don't lose the humor of it. Don't lose the humanity of it. It's easy to despair, right? And I'll fall and die on the sword that others can despair. Other people can despair. But the artist cannot despair. The artist cannot, like, that's the fucking last, that's like the central bank is the backstop for like all these other sort of shadow organizations that are like depending on it to exist. It's kind of the writer's job not to despair. Frank McCourt, that great writer, right? He's talking about, like, even in talking about hunger, there's some humor in it, right? For me, that's the path forward, is like not necessarily humor, but having a dynamic take on it.
I would piggyback off of Daniel's comment about humor, because I'm reminded by this comedian named Daniel Sloss, who is very into dark humor, and he gets that. He claims that's from his parents, and it's one of his, I guess, one of the first tragedies in his life was that his little sister died. She was very young, and he was very young at that age too. And so, you know, his parents have sort of like gone on to cope with that through very dark humor. And his point is about how the whole point of humor is to bring humanity back into a place that has lost its humanity, which is the tragedy. And I think that is kind of like what I feel resonates in what you said, Daniel. And I think one thing that I've been thinking about is sort of like this weird divide in perspectives, and like something that I've sort of like been seeing like glimpses of throughout, where there's like this, you know, the differences in responses between red and blue states, and, you know, what will that difference sort of boil down to once we're through this? You know, what can we sort of imagine of the past that we're currently living through, is a question that I would field to all of you.
All you writers, you'll be able to correct me. I always get the two confused, Emerson and Thoreau. I don't know why. But there's a quote from one of the two of them. It's there's a crack in everything God has made. That's how the light gets through. Is that Thoreau?
I'm pretty sure that, yeah.
Okay, Thoreau. There we go.
Naturalists were all alike.
Yeah. I guess that's why I just get confused with them. I once smoked a bunch of cigarettes rolled with the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson because I ran out of rolling papers. So
that's great.
Yeah. But I think that humor functions in that way, right? Is it creates a crack so that light can come through, because if not, the despair can become too much. And
you make time to laugh, because the despair will find you. Like that will find you 100%, man. You know, laughter will not always find you. You got to make time to laugh. You got to make time to have joy.
Yeah.
I think it was something that my grandmother, my dad's mother, used to say to me all the time. She says, even if it's not funny, you still have to laugh, because what else is there to do? Because it if you don't laugh about it and you don't find the humor in it, then you're gonna fall into a pit of despair, and that's not good. Yeah. So she used to say that a lot. No matter how, it's the fact that it is so unfunny that makes it funny.
Yeah. Oh man, it's hard. It is hard to laugh these days, I will say. Like I feel like completely just numbed out of just like it like time is a construct. I feel like, you know, they time is a flat circle. You know,
I have been obsessive lately. Catherine, I've actually been doing a series of prints based off of Nietzsche.
Yeah, no, but I do feel like, wow.
I found myself consuming dark content a lot. Like, and I enjoy dark content to begin with. Let's face it, I write realism, so it's like, it's a thing. But like, I caught myself last night. I have insomnia because of my anxieties, like amped up being trapped at home. And I'm watching, which I've read Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, and it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. I decided to start the television series at like 1 o'clock in the morning last night when my whole household is asleep. And I'm like, oh, this seems like fun entertainment. I mean, it was great. It was very entertaining, but I was also terrified. I thought the pile of laundry was going to murder all of us. And I'm just like, what? There's this like almost compulsion to consume darker content right now. It's almost like, am I looking for something that is more fucked up than what I'm experiencing? Because
What's the impulse you think?
I'm also reading Forshay's book right now, and
talk about dark, man. Shit.
It's amazing. It's great.
I want to write Station 11. Yeah, the whole flu pandemic thing.
I love that book.
So, you know, when this first started, like maybe like a week or 2 weeks into the quarantine, I was like, I might as well just get it out of my system now and just reread Stephen King's The Stand.
Yes.
It's funny, but that book it's been like a new bestseller again, along with The Plague. There's been like this huge surge in that. The movie, what was it called? Contagion, I think it was a Soderbergh film. He had to go online and tweet, like, stop watching my movie. Like, now is not the time.
Real quick, I just want to say two things. Thanks, Vinny, for your comment earlier. I appreciate that. But then also, like, I wonder if that impulse is to like get to the how bad can it get? And once you have a sort of grounding in that, you're like if I watch Contagion, is that as bad as it can get? If that's as bad as I can get, I can get through that. You know what I mean? Sort of grounds in like how bad it is, and maybe that's why we seek out the dark when it's dark.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, like, I think maybe why people catastrophize is so that they can just get it all out on the table, and like by imagining the worst, they can think about, okay, how are they going to individually be okay when that happens, and then that can actually maybe for some people bring a sense of comfort and peace.
Yeah. You see Trump doing that, where he's like, only 40,000 people died. I'm like, what the fuck? That's 40,000. That's like a half of a football stadium or something.
Yeah, but for him, it's different because it's out of sheer narcissistic self-delusion.
Yeah.
I mean, how many casualties were there in Vietnam? Was it around 50,000?
So 50,000.
So we're practically at that number.
Yeah, I feel like I'm in denial. I mean, I have not really been reading any news about coronavirus because I figure I'm already hearing about it so much anyway, and it's just like it's I feel like I'm in denial about just how grave this is.
I stopped listening to the news before going to bed. It's been that's how I go to sleep. My fiance and I always go to sleep. We put on Rachel Maddow and just kind of drift off. And it was already a lot of horrible shit we had to drift off to, but now it's just like, it's impossible. I would get like heart palpitations. So I've had to switch it to the morning. It's not great to wake up to either, but I kind of can't keep myself away from it. Even the number, like last time I checked, it was around 20,000 deaths. And then I didn't really check for a day or two, and it jumped up to, over 30,000. It's pretty inconceivable. I mean, when it really sinks in, I know it's having a psychological effect.
So we should, one of us staffers, I'm not sure who posed the question, but somebody said, Shakespeare lived in a time where plagues were a common occurrence, a daily life. How does the bard in his work bridge the gaps of our imagination in this present day existence? And we were joking amongst ourselves the other day as well that some amazing creations have come out of this exact type of situation in the past, right? Creatives and scientists and people socially distancing, quarantining in their homes. I think Newton in calculus. Of course, we talked about Shakespeare. I couldn't remember. We had a couple other people on our list, but.
So I actually, I'm wrong about this. I thought that Shakespeare wrote Lear while in quarantine from a plague, but actually Roseanne Cash tweeted that, and it turns out she's not the best source. That's not actually true.
I love your humbleness.
Well, I wanted to share something with all of you, which I think is just really interesting and kind of pertinent. But in the 1300s, when the plague actually came to Europe, it came on ships that were bringing across paper that held rats that nested in the paper. It introduced the rats to Europe, and it was because of printmaking.
Wow. Wasn't it in like they had held it off the coast for like so long, much like those Carnival cruise ships where they were just
yeah.
It's in my medieval literature class, like an undergrad, and just like it was like, but you know what's the crazy thing?
Paper.
There were waves of the plague, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the last one was like the 18th century or something crazy like that.
Or yeah, totally. And it just kept spreading, and it would go down, and it would peak, and
This is
interesting. I had a show in Serbia about plague doctors, and I was being interviewed for the television station there. And the lady actually asked me, how did I know about the plague? Because I was an American.
What the
And I
hell?
told her I was a history, double major in college, European specifically. Yeah.
Wow.
But no, that's just an interesting thing. Anyway, just want to share.
Yeah, no, it's like I also do wonder, like, all right, so people who created during plague times, like, science was, they're talking like the humors of the body and stuff. Like, it was like, now we know now so much about like modern medicine that it's like we're talking about like not watching the news before going to bed. If you were like vaguely aware of what's happening and you're for me, it's like, I don't know. There are two people I know who are like the people who cannot get anything done. Like, I was talking to Lisa Lucas the other day, National Book Foundation lady. She's like, I can't get anything done. Like, I can work for like maybe 45 minutes a day, an hour a day. I have to get my schoolwork done. I'm sort of like with Giuseppe, where I'm like, I can't afford not to not get this done. I got to get this done to finish the end of the semester. But there are like a handful of people I know who are really doing their best work, and I'm like, what the fuck? What is that? They got to be psychopaths.
We're running generative workshops, just saying. Ben's been running them for us. They've been actually really amazing. So Ben has had some really, really great prompts. And to be fair, though, that first one was quarantine, and that was unfair.
Oh.
But I think that's also really cool, too. That there is this genuine desire for people that are creative to still try and have a sense of the community that we had before. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, we've only had like 1 or 2 people at our home at a time, with a large amount of space in between those visits, pretty much to maintain my sanity. And I just find that like there's a deeper value to those moments. The conversations seem more meaningful and intimate, and it might be the circumstances. It might be because I'm naturally a sentimental being. But I found myself talking on the phone to a friend for over an hour that I'd never spoken that long to him ever. Like, we'd seen each other at a number of social gatherings, but like just sitting on the phone, just talking about like, oh, his experiences with this, my experiences with this, and what we've been up to. But so there is like this, yes, we're distant, yes, we're separate, but I think I'm also experiencing people being more willing to admit their vulnerabilities and their desires to be amongst others. Whereas before, some people have an aloof air, and it's like, we don't really need others. And now nobody can really deny that need right now. And it's kind of maybe it's my menopause kicking in again, but it's kind of a warm and fuzzy thing. Like, and it's a weird juxtaposition against the terror of pandemic.
I mean, I hope that's true. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, the real horror show is all the information that I'm trying to keep apprised of as some sort of stability, to think that, well, okay, I'm reading the reliable sources, and yet I'm also reading about the bubbles of echo chambers of large swaths of the population that are not reading reliable sources, and the kind of disinformation that's going on, right? So I think that this. So, I mean, two things. I mean, so the horror shows about the disinformation and about values. I mean, I do hope the kind of compassion that you're talking about will happen, right? But there's this, trenchant, personal freedoms rhetoric in this country. I mean, if you watched what happened in Austin today, there were all the protesters were unmasked and so forth, right? I mean, it's unclear. Although I don't tend on an optimistic note, have you been reading about, and you probably have all experienced, that we're dreaming in particular ways, that that the quality of our dreams has sort of changed. I feel this personally, that because we're not getting the stimulus of the outside world, the dream machine at night is actually going further back into the past, and I've certainly experienced this in ways that
completely agree.
Really pronounced, like really vibrant dreams. So there's been some articles about this, and to me, that might be the way in which we think about being together, how to live together, how to live collectively, because we're going to have to find some way, whether in real life or in these other ways of being of socializing together. And I don't know. I mean, I really think that on the one hand, the only way that we're being able to be together is through the through electronic media, but it's the very media that allows all this kind of disinformation campaigns to just go rampant, right?
Mhm.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I saw what happened in Austin today, and you know, I couldn't believe it. I mean, but I don't know why it's a surprise to me. And the crowd chanting "Fire Fauci." It's just like this anti-science. You know, silence the people who are, you know, right and reasonable. And it just goes to show, you know, how far we've come technologically, and yet that attitude is medieval, in my
I mean,
opinion.
it's Alex Jones from InfoWars, right? Who's
Oh yeah. You know, this is kind of an aside, but I met him once. This was many years ago. I was writing for the Hilltop Views, the university newspaper in Austin, and at the time he was praised by the far left. You know, he kind of swung around, and I just thought he was, you know, completely full of it back then. So I had the chance to meet him, and he was signing, you know, his DVDs or whatever, and I got the chance to sign my article. It was called "Conspiracies Don't Add Up," and I signed it for him. So that was like a really great moment.
There's a pretty good podcast in the New York Times that just launched yesterday or today called Rabbit Hole, and they're actually following this one young man who, through YouTube, began to radicalize through these, you know, through people like Alex Jones and InfoWars. I mean, and it's really about the algorithms that allow this to happen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's technology is in a way it's something, it's since the advent of the internet, it's like it's shown itself to be more and more of like this weird kind of double-edged sword. Like I remember people hoping like, okay, the internet is going to be the ultimate democratizer of humanity, and like, you know, reason and you know, solidarity and, you know, collective human action to solve all these pressing problems. But like the internet has turned out to me like to be the democratization of idiocy in a lot of ways, and it just allows these completely you know, racist, anti-science and misogynistic, you know, totally you know, just horrendous views to become like on par as this quote unquote other side to this supposedly even-handed debate, because we don't even have any, there's like no concept of truth anymore. And it's like, if something that's a pandemic, even something that like, it doesn't care if you're Republican or Democrat, it doesn't care if you're Trump or not Trump, it doesn't care, like it can kill anybody. If even that can't, you know, bring back this kind of remooring of like truth to reality, then what can? I mean, that's the thing I think about a lot these days, and that kind of I try to stop myself from thinking about it too much, otherwise, you know, get depressed.
No, I want to come from that because I think it's a really intriguing question. I think a lot of people, the way in which we look at sort of like populist, you know, characters, the people who really believe in this sort of like the Alex Jones of the world, we always treat them almost like the way in which we sort of like denigrated like the Bernie bros or something like that, where they're like, what is wrong with them that they believe X, Y, and Z? Like, but like, where does that impulse come from to want to believe? I feel like that's the more philosophical, or that's the more germane question. Is it like, because everyone's know what that's like, where you're like, hey, lizards run the world, and you're like, I kind of want to believe that, right? Like, what is that about, right? What's down that rabbit hole, right? And you, of course, you know it's dumb or whatever. And it's not, we treat these people like they're kind of like idiots or something, like, or maybe they're less critically thinking. And I think there is a lot of truth to that. But where does that impulse to want to believe come from? What is it replacing? That's the more germane question for me, which is like, what is that? Like, and a lot of people have explained it away in terms of like, oh, it's about safety, it's about economics, it's about explaining the world, or has it, you know, replaced religion or whatever it is. But I'm like, that's the $1 million question for me. Like, where does that instinct, that's obviously like, it's affecting a lot of people. Got enough people to elect this guy president, you know?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, to me, like, I guess part of where that instinct may come from is just when there is no real certainty, then people want to have it's better to have an explanation than no explanation. People, it's like people don't want to possibly believe that, you know, things are the way they are, you know, for this complicated myriad of reasons. It's easier for them to, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something about a certain kind of comfort of having some kind of explanation that makes sense as opposed to having no explanation.
Yeah.
I agree with that, but I think as human beings, we don't really realize the extent of our mortality just as a species, not as individuals. And because we can't really access and like understand our mortality as individuals until we're at that brink of death, until we're at that moment where death can come, we cease to think for the future and we only think of the now. That's a very human thing to do. And so looking at our environment, looking at COVID as something that is a product of us is hard to grasp because global warming and all of these earth-changing things just feel so far away. Like they've been taught to us that this is sometime in the future, not the immediate future, but it's here now. And how we react to it, how we change from this moment, and really truly grapple with our mortality, is going to be what's, I think, philosophically, is what's going to carry us into this weird new future.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to put it. And what you know, the word that came to mind when you said all that is this idea of responsibility. If a problem is so complicated, well, actually, simple in some terms, but then in other ways, like so far off on the horizon, so imperceptible, so intangible, so non-immediate, so seemingly invisible, yet, you know, catastrophic for humanity if left unaddressed, then it's like how to feel a sense of responsibility and what is our responsibility as individuals at the same time, you know, who are limited by a system which ought to have, you know, if we're going to solve this problem, there has to be responsibility on like a system wide level. And like the climate change thing is a perfect example. It's like, I realize how horrible this is. I realize how it's being contributed to and nothing's being done about it. But then I realize, like, okay, my actions as an individual consumer on it and every day don't help it. But then all these things that I have to consume, why are they being produced in the first place? And it's just like, how to feel a sense of responsibility when things are so intangible and imperceptible. You don't even know how to plan or think about acting.
I completely understand. It's like this idea that we are so kind of reliant on capitalism because it has been the thing that has lasted in this country the longest. This is our system of government that has pushed us forward, that suddenly having to transition to not be reliant on this system of you get everything that you want immediately and you don't question where it comes from, you don't question how it's made, you don't question the ethics of it, just becomes this really weird, like, makes me think of like Judgment Day when I'm like, to the gods that be, like whoever it is, whoever is judging my time on earth, am I being a bad person just by being a normal person because I'm partaking in this system that is so horrible and so oppressive? So what does this mean for everyone who partakes in it, who doesn't understand a lot of what capitalism means to populations of people? And I hate bringing in like being the person who brings in the race card, but I am the person who brings in the race card consistently because it is a system and it is there. And this pandemic is only pointing out how flawed this system is and how set against people of color. Like it Like it really is. Like every day at my job, my main job is figuring out how I'm going to help low-income students who don't have access to internet, and then looking at the internet as a commodity, as something that is necessary for each and every individual human, as technology as something that each like individual person on this earth needs to survive now. And so that's where my brain's at, and I feel like I went off on a really horrible.
Yeah, but it's like in order to just carry on your own life, you have to participate in this system
Yeah.
in order to survive. And not only that, but you have to exploit the very same comrades who you realize are being exploited. It's like you have to exploit your own comrades to support, to just get along.
Exactly. I completely agree with that. Completely.
Yeah.
I have a quick question for Professor Tejada. It might be a little off the wall, but it's just something that the conversation kind of made me think of. You've quoted William Gibson before, and like a lot of people, I grew up reading cyberpunk. So that's just been, I mean, it feels really prophetic right about now. And at the same time, there seem to be these kind of strange, obscure philosophical movements mostly exist online. I'm thinking of like the accelerationists and these people who, are kind of preaching capitalism that's almost feudalism, corporate feudalism, the rise of neo-China, as they always, I mean, these movements are obscure and kind of under the surface, and yet they really terrify me. And it seems like this is the kind of event that certain people have been, waiting for with bated breath to take advantage of. How much of a threat, philosophically or otherwise, do you see that those kind of thoughts as?
I mean, I've been following some, but you're right. I mean, just to think of the case of accelerationism that we're seeing some of its tenets being played out now. I mean, I think what Daniel was saying is important, which is that they are versions of their versions of their descriptions. They, as any other kind of description, right? That, but what we can do is to counter those descriptions with other ones in which we're radically placing ourselves, even in the imagination or the desires and fears of those that we have very little in common with, as a way of trying to understand how to create new ways of basically creating collectivities, right? I mean, it just seems to me that it is about new ways of possibilities for understanding, and I mean of deeper understanding, right? It does seem like religion because the stakes are so high, right? And what our deepest, what we want is a conviction and some kind of faith in the ability to even wake up to a future that's the next day, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is where like those kinds of literatures like Gibson and so forth also provide us kind of templates to think about, well, all right, it seemed predictive, but we can easily use it as a way of creating alternate endings to those stories, right?
Yes.
I sort of want to dovetail from that for just a second, just because I got me thinking of this, like that essay from Gia Tolentino on like Chopped and Screwed, that sort of like genre of music in Houston, where she talks about why there are so many mega churches in Houston. And she talks about sort of how in a mega city that has no real public space, like the churches are like their own little villages. And I think about that too, like this sort of moment we're in which we're sort of all being sort of like siloed off, isolated. And there is some sort of silver lining to backtrack sort of what Tamara was saying along the terms of like, these scripts that we've been following in society, whether it be racism or whether it be sort of like classism or whether it be any of the isms, right? You're saying, well, you start really critically thinking along the lines of like, why is it that I'm exploiting my comrade to live a decent life or whatever? We're questioning these things, but what that is a silver lining. But what could very well happen, I think about this, is my big fear for this moment we're heading into, is that siloed off to way backtrack a lot further to sort of like going down the rabbit hole of that podcast Roberto mentioned, which is sort of like, what left to our own devices, what void are we filling, and with, you know, why do we feel that urge to believe in like a Bilderberg thing, or to believe that lizards are people or something like that? What is that replacing? In Gio Tolentino, we would argue that, you know, sort of is replacing, you know, religion is replacing the village, right? And for me, I get so terrified of that. Like, do people siloed off coming out of this come out more radicalized? Do we come more disparate as a country? I think it's very possible if the algorithm has its way. And I think the algorithm will have its way.
I think very much in the vein of the algorithm, every great empire in history, you can pretty much catalog their decline within the last 100 years, right? There's always, as a historian myself, as someone who has studied history so prolifically, that is the first thing we look at. We look at that when they fell, and then 100 years before, and backtrack even more if there is an inclination that this is what is going to start the decline. And I think in America, it's been happening, in my opinion, as a, you know, unprofessional historian, since 9/11. And since that, I think that event in my mind is the catalyst that has then kind of trickled us into this entire mess. But then the argument could also be made that the Cold War was it, that all of these other things are an like what's happening now is an amalgamation of all of those things that happened then. And I think we are seeing, if not a decline, a significant dip as the world's leading nation, especially since 2016. I think America has kind of lost its nostalgia of being the land that you can make yourself in. The immigrant's dream is gone completely. And this is just my opinion, my very cynical opinion, but
no, you had me thinking along the lines of even like American individualism and sort of like the lonely cowboy, sort of like we fall how we lived, which is just like lonely. Our
literal manifest destiny has taken us to the point where there is no return, and everyone has kind of figured out what our agenda is, and we made our bed. We kind of have to sleep in it. Is where I'm at.
I'm tempted to posit like a thought. Like I'm reminded of what you mentioned very early on in this discussion, Daniel, about your wife's uncle who passed away recently, and how, you know, I think there's a weird sort of like we're taking for granted, some of us who are used to this sort of like living in this like solitude, you know, as writers, and then there's the other half who can't do this situation and have to sort of been forced to adapt to living like this overnight. And I'm thinking of that in relation to like this line by this Chinese professor named Yan Lianke, where he's sort of like saying, while the bodies are not cold yet and people are still mourning, there's also songs of praise, you know, being sung. You know, there's like this, for me, I find like there's this sort of, I guess, multiplicity of point of views. And I would bring that to like Professor Tejada's comment about like, you know, that what does like those collectivities, right? Like what is bridging those, what is forming those look like? What are the processes that we would be imagining now to get to those spaces? I feel like there's something to be said about like this because I know that there was this thread in this conversation early on about like you know, like truth, and there's a missing like center for people. That's why we turn to religion or some sort of belief to sort of fill that missing center. And I feel like that's sort of like an element of like the postmodern condition that is in play. And I think that maybe part of it is this postmodernism that we're living in that is coupled with capitalism and a kind of cynicism, you know, that comes with it. And there's like this lacking of like a kind of radical empathy that I thought I was hearing sort of Professor Tejada was mentioning, was like, you know, that kind of people whose views are so wildly radically different from you, like what is crafting that space of understanding them look like? And I felt like you were sort of talking about like that kind of radical empathy earlier there.
That's my hope. Yes.
I think not just like radical empathy, but I think that to generalize like community, as I can continue to do our realization of what propaganda is and what it does and how it's used is not understood to the extent that I think people should understand what propaganda is, where it started, and how the internet and technology have kind of taken what was so it was influential, but now it's like you've amped it to 1 million. Like this is like, we have never been in a point of humanity where we are all talking to each other like we are now. Like at a click of a button, we can literally reach the entire world. This is the first point in history where that has happened. And of course, the first thing we do is start inching up advertisements and like propaganda is what is my point, I guess. So I think that's like inevitable, especially in a situation like this.
Well, so the things that you guys are doing right here are like actually really important. You're cultivating these spaces, you're cultivating these sort of conversations. And ultimately, I think the propaganda lifeblood of it, for all that's been said about it, is like that need for community. People believe what they need to believe because they want to be in the right. They want to be in some sort of larger thing. And I think, this is sort of part of that, these critical discussions, art, film, visual art, all this stuff, right? Literature is sort of, you bring people back to the light, you know? I think it's very cheesy, but I really believe that. I really genuinely believe that. That's the backstop of all of this. And it's important that you guys keep doing this.
Well, I think that we're losing people left and right. Everyone stayed on.
It's AWP again. It's us and Pena.
Yes.
It's us and Pena. Yeah.
Always down for the long haul.
Good seeing you guys. Thanks for putting this on. I was really touched to be a part of it. Thanks for that beautiful introduction.
Oh, it was such an honor. It was, and I think that having this pre-recorded to share, it's gonna mean a lot. Like I've already had people online asking,
I have people that want to see this already.
Really,
yeah.
and
They're like, when is it gonna go up? Yeah.
This is taking the form of community that we're all missing so truly right now.
Yeah. Well, dude, always good seeing you guys. Keegan, Vin, Tamara.
Yeah.
Miranda, Christopher, what's up, man?
Ready for the last episode of Plot Against America?
Oh my God, just folks. I love that Tortura, just folks. That weird fucking voice.
Oh yeah, I mean, oh my God. him and Winona Ryder are just like, ugh.
Yeah.
It's on my watch list.
Yes, please.
It's terrifying.
On my watch list.
She's just
please don't spoil.
It's deeply unsettling. Well, everyone be safe. Vin, good night, everyone. It was lovely seeing your beautiful faces, one and all.
Bye, all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.